Thanks for joining this special webinar hosted by the Royal Statistical Society Special Interest Group of Statistical Engineering. My name is Ron Bates. I'm the co-chair of the SIG, and if you want to find out more about us and who's on the committee, I see Lindsay's on the call. Lindsay's the co-chair with me of the SIG. Please go to the website. I'll put the link in the chat where you can also sign up for our newsletter if you haven't already done so. We aim to put out a newsletter about once a month. So let's just give you the blurb about us. The Statistical Engineering SIG aims to provide a forum within the RSS for people working in or with an interest in engineering and the application of statistics to engineering. So we're aiming to foster professional collaboration between statistics and engineering, particularly in the professional bodies, and us as a committee. We try and reflect that aspiration through having a diverse background in statistics, engineering, and beyond. I'm a chartered statistician and a chartered engineer, and I've worked kind of in the two fields for pretty much all of my career. So just a little bit about these webinars. In general, RSS webinars are free to RSS members and available to non-members for a small fee. Now they've kindly agreed to host this webinar, make it available to everybody for free to help us promote the special interest group. And moving forwards, we're hoping to have a few more free events, but we'll probably also have some paid events. So please consider joining the RSS if you're not already a member. You'll have these and other webinars available to you for free. Okay, let's move on to the webinar. So honoured to have Eric Maas presenting to us today. Eric's also part of the committee. Eric, I believe you're now retired from your position as
semi-retired, yes,
as a senior director. Medtronic Restorative Therapy Group, where you led integration of statistical engineering into their product development programs, which I'm sure wasn't easy. But you also have a rich background in Six Sigma, Motorola, and being a lead master black belt for design. So bring a wealth of experience to the table. And as you can see, we can see the title of your talk here on screen. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Eric.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Welcome, everyone. Okay, so yes, the Special Interest Group, Statistical Engineering. So the title of this talk, Statistical Engineering for a Robust Product Development. I put an image at the bottom of the screen. That image will make a little bit more sense a little bit later on. It'll actually be within one of my slides later on. I also gave this talk a little bit of a subtitle. See if I can get my mouse over to the right frame over here. Going from deterministic to statistical engineering, there's our title, Statistical Engineering, to develop compelling new products. And hopefully you'll find some of these examples rather interesting and compelling. So first off, since we're combining statistics with engineering and statistical engineering, let me start with a little bit about engineering, and I'm going to use a few quotes that are a little bit more uplifting quotes. So the first uplifting quote I'm going to use over here is this one right here. Scientists discovered the world that exists. Engineers create the world that never was. That's from Theodore von Karman, an aerospace scientist. And we have a postage stamp in the United States honoring his contributions to the world of aerospace science. And coming from the world of literature, a famous author, scientists dream about doing great things. Engineers do them, and that's by the famous author James Bickner, who wrote Tales of the South Pacific that became the musical in the movie South Pacific and The Source and so forth. So those, again, are more positive, idealistic views of engineering. Let's go with something a little bit more cynical. So here's a quote from a British engineer about 50 years ago. Engineering is the art of modeling. I underline modeling because I'm going to come back to modeling in our talk today. Engineering is the art of modeling materials we do not wholly understand into shapes we cannot precisely analyze, so as to withstand forces we cannot properly assess, in such a way that the public has no reason to suspect the extent of our ignorance. A little bit more of a cynical view of the whole thing. That's from Dr. Dykes from the British Institution of Structural Engineers, as they said about 50 years ago. But if we analyze that, first off, I'm going to come back to the word modeling because, yes, engineering is largely about modeling, and that's what I'm going to build on today. When he talks about the issues over here, we're talking about uncertainties, and that's where statistics comes into the picture. So if we can merge or meld statistics with engineering and something that we can call statistical engineering, we can make it even stronger and maybe overcome some of those uncertainties and some of those things and not have to worry about the public having a reason to suspect the extent of our ignorance. Now, there's a book that was written a few years ago, and it's still a bestseller, Thinking Fast and Slow, written by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002. And he largely won the Nobel Prize in Economics because he and Amos Tversky worked together in overcoming the theory that economists had about how we humans make decisions and approach challenges and problems in our life. Now, I think all of us here have kind of a STEM background, science, technology, engineering, math background, and all of us have some of whom also have STEM backgrounds. And we may notice, certainly I noticed, and hopefully some of you also may notice, a bit of a difference in the way STEM people approach problems and make decisions, and non-STEM people do. And some people might attribute that to intelligence, but a lot of the people who are non-STEM are actually very, very intelligent. I would not attribute it to that. I will attribute it to what I think Daniel Kahneman is kind of saying a little bit in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Most of us, especially people who do not have science, technology, engineering, math backgrounds, most of them approach problems the way that he found people make decisions using heuristics, which is a fancy way of thinking, a way of saying, thinking in terms of rules of thumb. Like in the world of economics, if you see something you might want to buy, but the price is very low, there might be something wrong with it. That's a heuristic. If I don't know what to do, I will follow what other people do, or I will do what the experts say I should do. And we have a whole set of heuristics gone wrong are called biases, and consistency heuristic is probably better known for its bias called confirmation bias that many of us heard of and use in common language conversations these days. So those are examples of heuristic thinking, and that's the way all of us, STEM people and non-STEM people, but particularly non-STEM people, have that as their primary way of approaching problems and making decisions according to Kahneman's work. Those of us who have STEM backgrounds, and I'll focus primarily on engineering, we have another way of thinking related to thinking slow, a form of thinking slow. And I refer to it as model-based thinking. We think in terms of models, abstractions of reality. Sometimes those models are physical models, like scale models of bridge or scale models of new industrial complexes, like shown here. Sometimes those models are mathematical models, equations like the ideal gas law, PV equals nRT, or Ohm's law, voltage equals current times resistance, or the ideal diode equation, I equals ISE to QV over KT minus 1 that I've come familiar with. Sometimes we use modeling as simulation. And so I'll show an example of here from my master's thesis, doing the simulation and modeling of a glucose sensor for people with diabetes many, many years ago. Now, quick little story before I hit the forward button in a moment. So a couple of years ago, for the first time in my life, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a conference in Las Vegas, and I was so excited. And shortly after I received that email, I had to go to physical therapy because I had something wrong with my leg. So I go to the physical therapy office, and I'm out there, and we have several patients and several physical therapists, all one-on-one in this fairly large room. And each of the physical therapists is working with their own patient, and my physical therapist is just making light conversation with me while she's working on my leg. And she asked me, so what's new with you? And of course, the thing that immediately comes to my mind is, very proudly, I was just invited to be the keynote speaker in a conference in Las Vegas. And she asked the logical question, what will your keynote speech be about? And I said, modeling. The room went dead still. Modeling. And I said, no, 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 nothing quite that glamorous. I'm talking about engineering modeling. And then the room went back to everybody doing their work there with their physical therapist. Anyway, so thinking fast is heuristic thinking. Thinking slow in the world of engineering is model-based thinking. And I've added the term deterministic. Most engineering work that we do is deterministic. The inputs determine immediately and absolutely the outputs. That is deterministic model-based thinking, and that's what engineers have learned, and it's very, very powerful. And we've done some amazing things in engineering using deterministic model-based thinking. But when we combine it with statistics, statistical engineering, we can go from deterministic model-based thinking to probabilistic model-based thinking. Another formal term for it is stochastic model-based thinking. And interestingly enough, this is something that was of interest to Kahneman and Tversky when they began their collaboration. 30 years before they won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, at the beginning of the collaboration, and the beginning of the collaboration actually started with looking at just differences between Bayesian approaches and the way people made decisions involving probabilities. And at the beginning of their collaboration, here's a quote: "Man is a deterministic device thrown into a probabilistic universe." So to make engineering even more powerful, it would be good to go from deterministic model-based thinking and bringing in statistical engineering, going to probabilistic model-based thinking. And some of the ways we can do that is things like Monte Carlo simulation, and we'll show some examples like this one here later on, and variance transmission, which has other terms as well, and Bayesian methods that I just mentioned. And you'll be seeing these examples a little bit later on as we go through my talk here. So this image over here, when Ron introduced me, he said I was involved with Six Sigma, actually from the very beginning. Six Sigma was announced to the world in 1988. I joined Motorola in 1979. I was one of the original people founding Six Sigma. And in about 1987, a year before it was announced to the world, another engineer named Tony Alvarez and I sat in an office and said, what would it take to have new products be at the Six Sigma level when they launched, rather than doing all this repair work afterwards? And we came up with this model, this conceptual model of what we would do to meld engineering modeling with statistical approaches, what we'll call today here statistical engineering, also called design for Six Sigma in this particular case. So just to describe this image for you, because I'll be using this in the course of the talk today. You start over here in this image. Hopefully you can see my arrows. These are your requirements. You've gathered the voice of your customers. You've translated them into measured requirements. And maybe if there's too many of them, you focus on a vital few, and those are represented by these arrows here. And then to have confidence in meeting them, you flow them down to the factors, the ones you control factors, the ones you don't totally control, the noise factors, and maybe using things like design of experiments, and I'll have an example of that. You filter this and find out of all the factors that could be important, which ones are statistically significant in terms of affecting your key requirements or responses. And then you can create a model relating your outputs or responses to your inputs or factors and make it probabilistic, bringing in your distributions from your noise factors, propagating or transmitting them through your model, and predicting your distribution of the outputs. And if the distribution is good enough, that will meet requirements over the range of things you don't control. It's a robust design, great. And if not, you can optimize your settings of your input factors, the factors you control, and optimize it. And I'll show you some examples of that over the course of our session today. Now, how do you come up with that model? Well, sometimes, as I mentioned before, the models can come from theoretical equations like the ideal gas law, P equals nRT, or Ohm's law, or whatever else. If you don't have a model, or you don't trust your model, you can use statistical methods like ANOVA if your y is continuous and your x is discrete, like different suppliers. Regression analysis if your x's and your y's are both continuous. Logistic regression if your output, your response, your requirement is path-scale or discrete, and your factors are continuous or discrete. And of course, if you have multiple factors, you can combine those analysis approaches, ANOVA regression, logistic regression, off of a designed experiment, DOE, or response service modeling, RSM, to come up with more quadratic kind of models. And these will give you models relating your factors to your inputs. But at this point, it's still a deterministic model. To make it probabilistic, you can combine these models with Monte Carlo simulation, variance transmission, or Bayesian methods. And I'll give some examples of those over the course of this talk. Okay, so um, let's start with an example of DOE, kind of the simplest examples I can come with in terms of the tools we use. I'll come up with a couple examples of using design of experiments kind of by itself, and then we'll go on from there. So here's an example from DOE. This is an example from Subang Co. over in Malaysia, a Motorola site in Malaysia. We were developing a new communication device, kind of shown here, and it was kind of noisy. So you see with no noise suppression. And so he used design of experiments to optimize the algorithm settings on the digital signal processor's firmware. So this is the before. These are the factors. Originally, just use a low and a high. And then from that part, he was able to figure out three of the factors, analyzing three of the factors were statistically significant, added star points, as you see on the right, star points, and was able to analyze this and get a quadratic equation, a polynomial, a quadratic equation for those three factors of how the noise suppression is influenced by those three factors in the algorithm. Then he was able to optimize the settings of the algorithm, and that was able to reduce the noise to what you see over there. And then we demonstrated it at a showing of these kind of devices in Paris, and it won the Best Innovation Award in Paris. So one example is just using DOE. Let me show you another example. I'm going to show you the use of it beforehand. Let me start from that again. I'm going to show you a little video of some people playing soccer, and one of the people playing soccer has a heart condition, and he's already had a device like this, a defibrillator, implanted in his heart. So you can see it going off here in a moment. So there you see him. He's collapsing on the field. The integrated defibrillator is about to go off, so you can stage move. The sinus rhythm has been restored. He regains consciousness. Requests to get back in the game, and the trainer denies the request. So that is a defibrillator in action. It's nice to see that. So one of the people I coached at Medtronic, interestingly enough, she's now a director. Almost all the people I show here, combining statistics with engineering has helped them in their careers, and almost all of them are directors or above. And here you see she's now a senior director at Medtronic, and I think she would say this was one of her pivotal moments. And in order to get that high enough voltage to defibrillate the heart, you see you need a step-up transformer, and you see here a picture of the step-up transformer and kind of a blow-away view. And you kind of see this is the older version of the defibrillator, and you see a picture of the newer version that Julie was involved with developing this new product, the new next generation of defibrillator. So we gather the voice of the customer, in this case, cardiologists, electrophysiologists at the top, and then flow them down to the requirements, in this case, the requirements on the transformer. So had to have a high enough voltage, 781 volts with 40 amp peak to be able to defibrillate the heart, and then flow down to requirements on the transformer, which you see here on the lower right. And so she designed an experiment. You see here the factors on the experiment. She did a low and high, just a two-level experiment, 2 to the 5 minus 1, I think, fractional factorial. And so you see the low level and high level for those 5 factors, set it up so that you could actually modify the levels based on the analysis of the DOE. So here are the requirements or responses, and there are a whole bunch of responses, as you see over here, on this transformer for a defibrillator. Here are the spec limits right next to them. But since she ran multiple replicates for each of the cells of the design experiment, she was able to come up with a mean and the short-term standard deviation and combine them into an index of goodness we call CPK. So if the CPK, capability index, is greater than 1.5, it's considered the Six Sigma level, and you see several of these requirements for the transformer are green, are at the 1.5 level or above, Six Sigma level. If it's between 1 and 1.5, still considered good for many applications, so that's showing in yellow. And if it's below 1, then it's showing up in red. And you see about 6 of these requirements for a transformer were in red initially, but then based on the DOE, she was able to come up with better settings of these factors and get almost all of them to have a CPK greater than 1, and most of them greater than 1.5, but one problematic requirement, primary inductance, stayed below 1, 0.25. So in that case, now she was able to focus on just one remaining requirement, primary inductance, work with the supplier, did Monte Carlo simulation on their process, help them see what was on green as well, met all the requirements for that transformer. Product was has since been launched and it's been a great defibrillator helping people like that soccer player you saw earlier. Next example I'm going to show you is still starting with DOE and RSM alone. This is a history study from my days, actually my last couple of years at Motorola. Motorola had a group involved in investing in startup companies. It was called Motorola Ventures. And you see a picture from their actual page at the time, no longer confidential. And they were investing in many companies. And one of the companies, little startup companies, was called E-Ink, a developer, as you see on the right-hand side, of display technology using E-Ink, electronic ink, high visual impact, very, very thin, lightweight construction, minimal power drain, drawing current only when you change state from dark to light or light to dark for your pixels in the display. So they asked me, Motorola Ventures asked me to work with E-Ink to help them develop a robust display. So we did a P diagram, a parameter diagram for the E-Ink display. We talked about what are the outputs and what could go wrong with the desirable outputs. A highly readable display is desired output. The error states kind of listed them out and thought about the things we do control, the control factors, and the things we're somewhat subject to that we want to be robust against variation in the noise factors, external environment, the different temperature, humidity. We wanted a display that would work well in Alaska in the wintertime, or in northern Scotland in the wintertime, or in Phoenix, Arizona, where I live, in the summertime. We also wanted to be robust against manufacturing variations. So in the studies, we had multiple batches of this E-Ink. And we also wanted to be able to use, be robust also to different levels of lighting, dark or light, nighttime or daytime, being able to read something on this E-Ink display. Now this with a set of seven requirements, measurable requirements, and for each of them, the mean and the standard deviation over the range of the noise factors, mean and standard deviation. So a total of 14 requirements, 7 means, 7 standard deviations. And we did a response surface design with 5 levels for each of the factors, kind of shown over here. And then we optimized, co-optimized, meeting all the requirements at every one of 12 temperatures. And we optimized the settings, figuring out this device would have a temperature sensor, detect the temperature, and come up with the appropriate sensing for that temperature. If it's Alaska, detects the temperature and sets the settings appropriate for Alaska. If it's Phoenix, different settings, and sets up the display to be appropriately set up and optimized for dealing with the heat of Arizona. And here's an optimization at one of the temperature ranges. That area in white is a sweet spot where we met all 14 requirements, 7 means, 7 standard deviations simultaneously. And that became the original Amazon Kindle display shown in my hand as well. So that was showing DOE, design of experiments, and RSM as an example of taking engineering further and combining it with probability statistics, primarily statistical engineering. I'm going to show an example, a couple of examples of combining design of experiments and the more advanced version of design of experiments, response surface modeling, with Monte Carlo simulation. So this is an example from Evan Patel, and continuing our tradition, he's now research program director at Medtronic on their software group in Louisville, Colorado. And they were developing something called Stealth Station S8, which is a way for a neurosurgeon to be able to do surgery on a person's brain and be able to see what they're doing and being able to watch it on a display and see what's happening real time as he or she is doing the surgery. So here he's moving or she's moving around. We have optical tracking latency, delays. We have processing, messaging, and rendering latency. We have display latency, and we want to minimize this latency so it's less than what a human can detect. A human can detect a latency of greater than 250 milliseconds. So even wanted to optimize the software and hardware, but primarily the software, to optimize the latency so it would be less than the noticeable 250 milliseconds of delay or latency. So he did a P diagram figuring out the control factors and noise factors involved in that latency. So came up with what their different factors were. And for each of the factors, came up with different levels in this experimental design, looking at the latency, and again, wanted to be less than 250 milliseconds. So we did a first screening design of experiment with 6 factors, 2 levels each. And did a follow-up on that, and then afterwards came up with 3 factors that were very important to the response service modeling, box banking design, to optimize the settings on that design. And this is showing you some of the results from its RSM, and showing where your latency would be bad, and being able to determine which factors from the software side and the hardware side, but primarily from the software side, would have those effects, and what they could do to eliminate those latencies that would have that performance issue of being greater than 250 milliseconds. How could he change the software so they would not have very many cases of a latency greater than 250 milliseconds? Then took that after he optimized into Monte Carlo simulation, showed that as it was before, about half the time there would be noticeable latency greater than 250 milliseconds. And after he optimized it, with that rendering optimization, got us to that less than 5% of the time would the latency even be noticeable to the neurosurgeon. Now, this also was a flawless launch. That's actually the title of one of the books I wrote called Flawless Launches. So this is an example of a flawless launch. This product was launched with high yield, no problems, great reception. It was a wonderful, no supply chain issues when it launched. It was a flawless launch. Around the time we were getting ready to launch this product at Medtronic, Hollywood came a-calling. They were about ready to come out with a new Marvel movie, and the main character in this Marvel movie early on was a neurosurgeon, and then he has a car accident. And after the car accident, he eventually becomes a superhero. And so early in the movie, Hollywood wanted Medtronic to offer some equipment that would be used in a scene early in the movie while he's still a neurosurgeon. And so they used Tell Station SH in the movie Doctor Strange. And so we had everybody from our Medtronic side, or almost everybody on our Medtronic side in Colorado, go to the movie theater together. They used to, with a majority, but not all of the audience. And during the 10 seconds that Stealth Station S8 was on the screen, they all got stood up and started applauding furiously. And other people in the audience, of course, were curious what the heck was going on here. Anyway, so let me show you another example of DOE combined with, and theoretical equations combined with Monte Carlo simulation. And I'm going to use it with an example for a product that was the first product at Medtronic to use statistical engineering extensively. This product you see on the screen, and I also have it right here in my hand. Hopefully can show it on the screen here a little bit. Maybe you can see it over there. And I'm going to talk about all the different aspects, but particularly these little tines at the end of it in a moment. But let me go ahead and put this where it's safe from me dropping it. So micro. Pacemaker that goes inside the heart. So we gathered the voice of the stakeholders, the customers, electrophysiologists, cardiologists, and so forth. That's shown at the top in blue. Translated them into measure requirements and flowed them down. And this is the flow down you're showing over here. And I'm going to show you a little bit of it. Let's start on the left-hand side. This has to be very small because this is a pacemaker that's going to go inside the heart. That requires the volume to be less than 0.75 cc, the length less than 24 millimeters, the radius being smaller than a certain amount. So a couple of our engineers, James and Kenneth, worked together and optimized using Monte Carlo simulation the device radius that was dependent on this die stack thickness. So you see our picture of the die stack thickness. They did Monte Carlo simulation of the range of how thick this is and what you would have as a device radius based on that range using Monte Carlo simulation. And our CPK, our index of goodness, would be around 0.9. We wanted greater than 1. So now with this model, this probabilistic model using Monte Carlo simulation, they were able to do what ifs, different changes to the design. You see the kind of change down the bottom, and they were able to get the CPK predicted to be greater than 0.9, moved it up to 1.41, where we'd have high confidence we could make this in production. We could meet the requirement of a small radius. Similarly, for the length of this thing, the length is dependent on the size of the printed circuit board. We called it a hybrid at Medtronic. And you see the very small printed circuit board that goes inside. So here's the micro. It's a cylindrical object, and you needed to go inside there. We needed to miniaturize it. And so Hat Vaughn, one of our engineers, used Monte Carlo simulation to optimize the spacing so there would be no problems, minimize the spacing while not causing any problems. And he was able to get all the CPKs greater than 1.5 consistent with Six Sigma levels. So all the CPKs greater than 1.5, much smaller dimensions, and we were able to fit in the small size we needed for a pacemaker that would go inside the heart. Then my friend Arshad, who I actually just spoke to yesterday. Arshad is now the chief architect at IBM. He left Medtronic a couple years after this and went to IBM, where he's been doing wonderfully. And he was tasked, he's a mechanical engineer, and he was tasked with the fixation, the attachment, these tines attaching to the heart. So before I show you his work, let me show you a little video made between the University of Minnesota and Medtronic, kind of showing conceptually. Also, it'll show a little bit of an image of some of the early trial runs of working with a pig's heart, a porcine heart. So here we're showing it going inside the heart, the idea, initially trying to attach it to the heart. And here they're going to show inside of a pig's heart. And let's say if they place where they originally place it is not going to be a good place for pacing the heart, and we need to recapture it, we don't want to tear the heart muscle. So that's going to impose an upper spec limit of 3 newtons of attachment force. That'll be the upper spec limit. And then they reposition it elsewhere in the heart where we'll do a good job of pacing the heart. And there you want it to stay years and years and years. They do a tug test on that. And now we have a lower spec limit of 2 newtons of attachment force, fixation force. So what you had there, these spec limits were established by a man by the name of Vlad Grubak using porcine pork heart tissue, as shown in the upper right. And he worked with Arshad. Arshad was working with mechanical simulation using finite element analysis, a tool called Abacus. And they reduced the model error, the difference between the model and reality. As Vlad would do work in the lab, Arshad would model it, and Arshad was able to tweak his model so it very closely corresponded to what Vlad was getting in with actual porcine heart tissue. So reduce what we call the model error, the difference between the model and reality. And now we wanted to optimize the design of those tines using finite element analysis, mechanical engineering modeling, to be within the spec limits of 2 and 3 newtons, hopefully focused on the mean being around 2.5 newtons of fixation or attachment force. And you see a picture again of Arshad at the bottom. So he did a p-diagram looking at the control factors and the noise factors. A lot of those noise factors went into setting those spec limits of 2 and 3 newtons. You want to safely attach the heart, the air states detached from the heart. Now you'd have a pill-sized thing going through your blood vessels. That would be problematic. Or, as you saw in the video, damaging the heart tissue. Mostly he wanted to control for, a lot of these were taken care of by the spec limits of 2 and 3 newtons. Wanted to have the design be robust against manufacturing variation on the tines. And the control factors were the thickness of the tine, the length of the tine, and it curves, so the radius of curvature of the tine. So, quick little 2-minute introduction to design of experiments, if any of you are unfamiliar with it. If you only had one factor, let's say the thickness of the tine, we could represent it geometrically with a line segment. We have low thickness, high thickness, and we compare them maybe with a t-test or a NOVA, the difference between the attachment or fixation force at low thickness and high thickness. If we have 2 factors like thickness of the tine and length of the tine, we'd represent it geometrically with a square, low and high thickness, low and high length, 4 combinations to the 2 experimental design. But we have 3 factors. So geometrically, it's represented by a cube with these 8 combinations in 8 corners of the cube. I'm going to take that cube, move that in the next slide to the upper right. And these are the 8 runs that Arshad ran and on Abacus, the finite element analysis simulator for his modeling. And you see for each of those 8 combinations, low, high on thickness, low, high on length, 4 lows, 4 highs on radius of curvature for those 8 runs. This first run is this corner over here. This last run is this upper right corner over there. Ran those 8 runs, got the attachment force, fixation force, or should I call it the pull force, and a range, and some of them were close to 2.5, but none of them actually included the range of 2 to 3 newtons. But now, nonetheless, we could get a model by analyzing this designed experiment. So we analyzed it. And this is in Minitab, showing that the higher the thickness, the higher the attachment force or pull force. Length doesn't seem to have much of an effect, not very significant. You'll see that over here to the right. Here's the analysis in Minitab with a Pareto chart. And the length factor B is, and everything involving every interaction involving B is below this dashed line, the length. Anyway, the length pseudo error. And then the radius of curvature has a negative slope. The greater the radius, the less the attachment force. But then he added, at my suggestion, a center point. And you see the center point does not fit on this, so a linear equation would not be sufficient. And here's the analysis with the center point added in there, and talking about two types of model error, the difference between model and reality. Lack of it, not significant, but curvature, statistically significant curvature, which implied we need to go beyond DOE to response surface modeling. So he augmented his initial DOE. So here's the initial 8 runs, and then that's 9th run, the center point, and then added these 6 star points. So the initial 8 runs are these yellow dots over here on the cube. The center point is this blue dot, and then these 6 star points are these red dots. And when he analyzed them, he would get a quadratic equation instead of a linear equation. So he got the quadratic equation. I'll show that on the next slide. And now he could use this quadratic equation with Monte Carlo simulation, talking to the manufacturers of the tines and getting the range of thickness they would get. If we gave them a mean, what the range would be. If we gave them a mean on the radius of curvature, what the variation would be. Propagating, transmitting that error through Monte Carlo simulation to that quadratic equation shown here, and predicting the distribution of the fixation force. And the Monte Carlo simulation showed initially a large part of the distribution would be below 2 newtons of attachment force. We'd have, embolisms in the patients. That would be a very, very bad thing. But now with this model, he could optimize it, and he did, to get really good CPK, basically almost no probability, very minimal probability of ever having the fixation force beyond the spec limits of 2 and 3 newtons. And then the question that he and I had at that point is there just one optimal point? We found an optimal point. It gave us, but is that the only optimal point? Well, that takes us from Monte Carlo simulation to an alternative to Monte Carlo simulation discussed in this book, Statistical Models in Engineering. I'll mention on the next page. Going from Monte Carlo simulation to variance transmission. Variance transmission has multiple names. Variance transmission, statistical error propagation of errors. Generation of system moments method is a name that was given in the book by Hahn and Shapiro. But combining DOE RSM with variance transmission, or these other terms. And it says, as I mentioned this book, a classic book, Statistical Models in Engineering. How appropriate of a title of a book for something involved in statistical engineering, statistical models in engineering. So if you have a transfer function, y is a function of multiple factors, then as a first approximation, the mean is plugging in the means of all the input factors into the equation, and you can predict the mean of the output. And the variance can be estimated using the partial derivative of the equation and squaring it times the variance of each of the inputs. And the derivation is in Appendix 7A of Statistical Models in Engineering by Hahn and Shapiro. And so we can now use this and predict the mean from RSM, but also predict the variance and combine them together into a predicted CPK. So just making this a little visual for a moment, if you have a linear equation, then you have a variation of x, here x1. You can transmit it through your slope, your derivative, your slope b1, and predict the distribution of y. If you have a negative slope, it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative because we're squaring those terms, and you're propagating the variation of x2 through this slope to a very predicted variation of y. If you have a nonlinear equation, then you have areas where you have greater variation of your input being propagated, shown in orange, and lesser being propagated, shown in green, and similarly over here to the right. So what Arshad and I did then was we took our equation from our design experiment and our RSM, predicted the mean, predicted the variance using that equation from Hahn and Shapiro's book, combined the mean and the variance together into a CPK and a yield. Assuming a normal distribution, we can take the CPK and predict a yield from it. Basically, the CPK is 3 times the z-score. So taking your z-score and turning it into a predicted yield. So you see on the left-hand side, the response surface predicting the mean of the fixation force on the y-axis versus the important factors thickness and radius of curvature. And on the right-hand side, converting that into a predicted yield. What percent of these fixation times would be within our spec limits? You see, there's a whole optimal region. He was just not set on one point, but he had a whole region to choose among and work with his suppliers and find what is most manufacturable. And the next question, of course, is can you take this and optimize with multiple responses? Well, yes. Here's what we just showed before. For one response, you can do this with multiple responses. You can combine the CPKs into a composite CPK. You can composite yields by multiplying the yields. So that's what Chris Avery did for a medical telemetry inside of a implantable medical device. He had 4 requirements: detect threshold, the current IDD, the turn off time, and the turn on time. He was able to predict the yield as a function of the factors for detect threshold, IDD, turn off time, and turn on time, and then co-optimize them and show the composite yield surface. And he presented this at Medtronic and turned out to be a really good product. And I put my little dancing Tigger dancing on the optimal point with the white cliffs of Dover over there to the sides of that. But he thought that didn't look professional enough, so we replaced that. Here's where you have robust, stable yield for this medical telemetry application. Similarly, before I get there, and then he was showing before, he was an experienced engineer, Chris, before he done trial and error, the way engineers typically approach these engineering challenges. And you see with this trial and error, weeks of trial and error, he got an okay CPK for detect threshold, close to 1, not quite 1, a negative CPK, very bad for the current, and very low CPKs for turn on time, turn off time. But based on this approach, which just took him actually a couple of days, combining statistics with engineering, got all the CPKs greater than 1 in that optimal point you saw in my plot with the white cliffs of Dover a moment ago. Similarly, for Micra, Ryan Vogt worked with a supplier, Vishay, co-optimized the requirement on medical telemetry for basically the antenna, for the inductance, the direct current resistance, and the Q factor. He did a P diagram with the supplier, did DOE, design of experiments, response service modeling, optimized with Monte Carlo simulation, the CPKs of all the requirements, got all of them actually greater than 2 at the 6 sigma level, all the requirements, so that a physician is able to speak to the Micra inside the heart, be able to communicate with it, get readings to it, and program it, and whatever else. And the main purpose, of course, of a pacemaker is to pace the heart. So Ryan Foss and Naveed Alam, Ryan was an intern at this time, Naveed was an experienced engineer. They worked together on applying this kind of approach to the regulator that set the pacing voltage. So 4 requirements for the regulator, the current being drawn, the output voltage, stability, and ripple, and you had control factors and noise factors. And they modeled that where it was, and after weeks of trial and error, you see the Monte Carlo simulation on the right, and a couple of the requirements, the current being drawn and the stability, have a lot in the red, out of spec. But now that they had this model, the noise factors are shown in red over here. This is manufacturing variation. This is variation in how you use it. They were able to kind of come up with optimal settings and get really good CPKs greater than 1 on all the requirements. Then let me go over to Bayesian methods as a statistical method. Show you a couple of quick examples associated with Micra. This first example is Mike Campbell, senior principal engineer at Medtronic. He built a Bayesian belief network for the probability of harm coming from things going wrong if you implanted this pacemaker inside the heart. So you see kind of a diagram of his Bayesian network, diagramming, looking at the different things that could go wrong, and looking at the probability of harm to the patient, pulmonary embolism, harm from extraction, the probability of death, the probability of infection. And with this model, was able to optimize design to minimize the probability of harm to the patient. Similarly, we had a possibility we discovered in our manufacturing and testing of something going wrong with detecting a patient's motion. You want to pace the heart differently if somebody's running in a marathon or if they're sleeping. We had an accelerometer inside this pacemaker inside the heart Micra. And so Mark Porter and team used logistic regression combined with Bayesian methods. And so there you see Mark Porter, Jan Liu, and Sarah Burke, my intern Sarah Burke, and they built a Bayesian network looking at all the distributions and looking at the probability the pacemaker's accelerometer detecting the motion of the patient, getting stuck, stiction, and they were able to estimate that in vivo in a patient in normal life, the probability of getting stuck was less than 12 in a billion. That was considered acceptable risk, but nonetheless, they worked with the supplier to reduce that risk even further. When Medtronic negotiated with the Food and Drug Administration for the size of the clinical trial, we shared this work with the FDA, and based on that work, impressed them so much, they reduced the size of the clinical trial in half from 1,200 down to 600 patients, which allowed us to get to market earlier. And then in 2016, U.S. News and World Report named Micra, this device, the 2016 biggest achievement in medicine. Science fiction becomes science fact, 2016's #1 leadest pacemaker from Medtronic. And interesting enough, with all this work, we actually got to market 6 months ahead of schedule in the European Union and in the United States. So just kind of showing you where that is, just give you some examples. I have a little bit more to talk about in a moment, but maybe let me pause here, see if there's any questions, or maybe stop here if we're out of time. We'll see. But statistical engineering from robust product development, from deterministic statistical for compelling products. You saw the examples of Micra and Stealth Station. If you want, I'll get to Dioramas afterwards, so showing some examples I did not get to, but showing you some of the different products, and there's so many products that we've used this on very, very successfully. So let me pause for a second and maybe stop here if we have, but see if there's any questions in the chat room or whatever else. And if you want me to, I'll go through, I have a few more slides after this, but let's see if there's any questions. Just be a chance to rest for a second.
Well, thanks, Eric. That was really interesting talk. Some fantastic examples there. If you've got any questions, feel free to speak up or put them in the chat.
Hello, thanks.
Go ahead, Lindsay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Rob.
that was great. Thank you very much. I had a question about the optimization part. How were they doing that? Were they using the numbers or their own experience?
Yeah, so in the case, I had examples using different tools. In the case of using just DOE and RSM by itself, Minitab has a response optimizer, so we use the Minitab response optimizer. In the case when we were using it combined with Monte Carlo Simulation, we used Crystal Ball. It has an optimizer called OptQuest that was developed at the University of Colorado Boulder. For Bayesian methods, you can actually just run it backwards and optimize as well. And so we actually just kind of say, here's our optimal output. What is most likely the inputs that would give us those optimized outputs? And then we also use yield service modeling, which is something I was involved with patenting, and that was another way of optimizing.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you.
In response to those optimizations, did the sort of engineers say, okay, yeah, that makes perfect sense? Did they put any of their own sort of context into it? If you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. I think I know what you mean. Well, you saw the question that Arshad and I had. Is this the only solution in that particular case? But yeah, we in all cases, the people were questioning, does this make sense? In most cases it did, but we've had cases in some of the examples, not the ones I showed here, but some other examples where it didn't make sense and we had to find something that was wrong with some of our assumptions. But in general, we did that kind of check. We call that critical thinking, but we kind of challenged things and made sure it worked. And then we also would verify by actually do a test run. Okay, this is the optimum. Let's actually make it and see if it actually works as predicted, if it's in the range of what's predicted. So a verification run.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello.
Eric, that's all very interesting. As I understand it, you're doing the Monte Carlo off a model rather than off actual experiments on the piece of kit. So my question is, did you make, the model might be a regression or something like that, but did you make allowance for the fact that the regression isn't an exact replica of the reality, and did that come into the variance that actually goes into the calculation of your CP key? CPK.
CP and CPK. Yeah, it's very the capability in this. Thank you, Alec. Yeah. So when you run the regression analysis in DOE and RSM or in general with regression, you get a standard deviation of the error, the standard deviation of the residuals. I refer to it, and that's part of your model error. And so we could bring that extra term, and we bring that extra term into our Monte Carlo simulation. Yes.
Right. Okay. So there is an understanding that model isn't always a perfect.
Yes, all model. As George Fox
of...
famously said, all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Yes, indeed. Yes. One of my favorite quotes.
Yes, it's a great quote. Thank you. Other questions for me? Well, let me go on for a couple more slides, just in case, and give people a chance. So the question might be, well, how does this work? I showed you some individual projects. How does it work on the organizational success? So I'm going to show you two quick examples of statistical engineering and the impact on organizational success. So I was fortunate when I was at Medtronic, the 11 years at Medtronic. Most of the time I reported to Chandra Subramaniam, who was a very strong supporter of these approaches. And he actually made it part of his goal as the VP, the Vice President of Research and Development. So he set 3 goals for his R&D organization in developing more than 60 new products. Quality, which we define as a flawless launch with 0 design-related field corrective actions. That's what the Food and Drug Administration calls problems that involve customers and involve patients. Predictability of the project, being on time and on budget, with a goal of 92% on time and on budget. And the speed of product development. And he had a goal of 9 to 18 months. And at the end, as he and I were retiring from Medtronic, when Ron introduced me, mentioned that I have retired from Medtronic. I retired 5 years ago. So at the same time I retired, Chandra retired. And this is kind of the outgoing slides from Chandra. And we were able to reduce our design-related field corrective actions by 70%. Okay. So we were able to achieve most of these were flawless launches. I showed you an example of a flawless launch a while ago. And the ones that remained over here, actually, these were software issues. All but one of these were software issues, and we were not using this approach to statistical engineering on all the software issues yet. We just had it on a couple of them, like the Cell Station S8, which was a flawless launch, but we were not universally using statistical engineering on the software side. So 5 of these 6 problems over here were software issues where we did not use statistical engineering. The other one, the 6th one, was actually an acquisition, a company we acquired in China that, of course, did not use statistical engineering at all. Then we taught all the project managers to use Monte Carlo simulation on their project schedules, and we got them to their projects being 92% of our new product development projects being on budget and on schedule. And then we were able to use this predictive engineering on the product development process itself and reduce our development time by about a year on average. So very, very big successful. And it kind of reflected resource therapy group went from being the worst group in terms of its metrics in Medtronic to the best group. And our boss, Jeff Martha, was promoted shortly around the time we retired to CEO. He's currently CEO of Medtronic. And as I retired, he sent me a nice little note on LinkedIn. I miss working with Eric Moss. Your Six Sigma expertise is second to none, and your passion is effective. And I said thank you to him. But let me go earlier. This is an example from my days at Motorola. The man who coined the frame flawless launches that I used in my book, Flawless Launches, Profitable Products, Bob Epson coined this phrase, and this is his slide from 2006. And if you do the job the right first time, the problems become smaller. You don't have to do diving catches. That's kind of a football analogy that you may be less familiar with in Great Britain. And then he was starting showing results a few months later of using these kind of approaches. So these are the number of post-launch issues analogous to the field corrective actions in the medical device industry. These are post-launch issues with the supply chain or issues with the customers having to return products within 6 months over time. And this dashed line is when we started using statistical engineering on all new products designed for Six Sigma statistical engineering on all new products. This is the before and afterwards. Of course, I pulled these numbers into Minitab, did a little box plot. Before, a median of 7 post-launch issues, afterwards a median of 2, and that's statistically significant whether you do a t-test, a Mann-Whitney test on the medians, or logistic regression on the counts. Statistically significant. And so we use the idea of flawless launches. We also want to use it on all new products. All of the project managers were concerned that it would slow down our product development time. So I promised all the project managers and executives at Motorola, government and public safety, that I would take at least the first 10 projects using these approaches. and pull in the project manager and say, what was the impact on the schedule of using statistical engineering? Around 2/3 of the time, this is the actual things, these are the names of the candidates, these are their projects, this is the schedule impact. 2/3 of the time, roughly, and actually, according to project managers, had a favorable impact on the schedule about a third of the time, neither favorable nor unfavorable. A pleasant surprise to me, we did not have any occasions where using these additional methods that are fairly complicated and challenging and difficult, no cases where it had an unfavorable impact on the schedules according to project managers. I was rather pleasantly surprised by that. Then I retired from Medtronic. When I retired from Medtronic, one of the companies that contacted me was Arshad. You saw his example of his project. He was now the chief architect. He said, Eric, can you teach the people at IBM statistical engineering? And they actually have a little 4-minute video on LinkedIn that I linked to on our LinkedIn page as well. 4-minute video talking about before they started using this, they were in a cycle of design, build, test, learn, repeat, build, test, fix. And they have different speaking by different engineers and the VP of hardware development, Jack Gergenrother. And there's my friend Arshad over here. And at the end of it, they talk about what the impact has been, and it saved them more than $100 million and has reduced schedule risk. So, I wrote a couple of books. Flawless Launches Profitable Products. Earlier than that, I'd written a book called Applying Design for Six Sigma to Software and Hardware Systems. I have my email addresses if anybody has any questions or wants to contact me or whatever else. And I retired and wrote that book, Flawless Launches. There's my granddaughter. The week I retired from Medtronic was the same week my granddaughter was born. There you see me with my granddaughter and her dog, Sophia. So I like to say I was promoted from senior director to grandpa. Then a year later, I had my book written. So there she is at a year holding up my book, Flawless Launches, Profitable Products. So any more questions for me? These are some of the different companies I work with. Let me show you one quick thing here. This is one last example. This is Dustin Babbitt. He was primarily using Monte Carlo simulation with equations out of a textbook. He was working with surgeons on a problem with people's backbones, with their vertebra. And he brainstormed with spinal surgeons how to improve the spine, how to straighten out the spine, and all different concepts with surgeons on that. Then ran Monte Carlo simulation to predict the cost of the product and minimize the cost, predict the using first principles model equations, predict whether or not they'd be able to meet all the requirements. The implant sizes were all optimized using that optimizer that I was mentioning with Lindsay a moment ago. Optimized the schedule, got this to be on schedule. It won an internal award from Medtronic called the Beacon Award, being on time and on budget, exceeded sales expectations by more than 50%. Just kind of fishing with a clinical story. He had a cousin with a warm spirit and scoliosis. There you see some photographs of Dustin's cousin and his scoliosis. So Dustin talked to one of the doctors that he had involved, and using this medical device that Dustin helped develop using statistical engineering. And here are the before and after photographs of Dustin's cousin. And on the right-hand side, you see him after the surgical procedure using this product and getting ready for his senior prom at Dance United States at the end of the senior year, going there with a date, going on with basically a normal life. So sometimes this has an impact not only on the product and the organizations, but on people. Well, with that, I guess I'll kind of close and see if there's any more questions. Any last questions for me?
I don't have a question, Eric,
Okay.
but I'm really pleased that you mentioned that it was led by somebody that was really excited about stats in the organization, because that was going to be one of my questions. You need one of those.
Yes.
But I don't always know how to find them.
Very good.
So yeah, if anybody has any advice on that, that would be gratefully received.
Yeah, I may have some comments for you offhand, Lindsay, of how I've been able to do it, but I'll see if there's any other comments from anyone else.
Well, I think talks like this definitely help, don't they? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron.
It's
Thank you, Alec.
inspirational to see, statistics in action and engineering in action. The combination, the winning combination of the two.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you gave a great overview of that holistic view of how to optimize a system in the face of uncertainty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, have a wonderful day, and it's almost the weekend. Have a wonderful weekend. We're halfway to the weekend. We're almost there. I'm an optimist. Right. Have a
Thanks,
wonderful
Eric.
day. Yeah, thanks. Have a wonderful
Great
day, everyone.
talk.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone
Thank
for
you.
joining, and yeah, look forward to more talk soon. Thank you.
No.
Really good. Thanks, Eric.